Imagine stepping into a country where the moment you mention you're American, the atmosphere changes. The stares, the tension, the unsaid words. Why is there so much hostility? You might think the world respects the United States for its power, economy, and cultural influence, but not everyone sees America as the hero. In fact, in some nations, anti-American sentiment is at an all-time high. From bitter diplomatic disputes to deep-rooted historical grievances, the relationship between the U.S. and certain countries is more fractured than ever. Recent sanctions, military interventions, economic rivalries, and political disagreements have fueled a growing dislike for Americans in multiple parts of the world. So, which countries have the strongest resentment towards the U.S. right now? And what exactly caused this hostility? Stay till the end to uncover some shocking reasons behind this global divide. Let's begin with the first country on our list. Number 1. China. Tensions between the United States and China have been escalating for years, but in recent times, things have reached a boiling point. The trade war, military standoffs in the South China Sea, and U.S. support for Taiwan have all contributed to a deep-seated resentment. But the tipping point? The sanctions on Chinese tech companies like Huawei and TikTok bans have made many Chinese citizens see the U.S. as an economic threat rather than a partner. The Chinese government has repeatedly condemned American interference in its internal affairs, especially regarding Hong Kong protests and human rights accusations. The U.S. branding China as its biggest global competitor hasn't helped either. This rivalry isn't just about politics, it's affecting everyday people. Many Chinese citizens now believe the U.S. is trying to sabotage their country's rise to power. And with state-controlled media fueling anti-American sentiments, the perception is only getting worse. But what about Americans in China? While hostility isn't always openly displayed, many U.S. businesses have faced boycotts, and anti-American rhetoric is growing. With increasing propaganda labeling the U.S. as an aggressor, the divide between the two superpowers is becoming harder to ignore. Number 2. Russia. If there's one country where anti-American sentiment is openly embraced, it's Russia. The U.S. Russia relationship has been on a downward spiral since the Cold War, and recent events have only added fuel to the fire. The most significant reason? The Ukraine conflict. The U.S. has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, supplying billions of dollars in military aid, leading Russia to accuse America of prolonging the war. Sanctions have hit Russia hard. From freezing Russian assets to banning trade, the U.S. has directly impacted the Russian economy, creating widespread resentment among the people. State-controlled media frequently portrays the U.S. as an enemy, blaming it for economic struggles and international isolation. In the eyes of many Russians, the U.S. isn't just an adversary, it's the main obstacle to their country's progress. For Americans visiting Russia, the situation is tense. While violence isn't common, hostility can be felt in conversations, business dealings, and local attitudes. If there's one thing clear, it's that Russia and the U.S. aren't going to be on good terms anytime soon. Number 3. Iran. Ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, relations between the U.S. and Iran have been bitter, but in recent years, things have only worsened. The U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, reimposing severe sanctions that devastated Iran's economy. Many Iranians blame the U.S. for their financial struggles, believing that American policies are designed to weaken their country. But it's not just about economics, it's about history. The U.S. played a major role in Iran's past leadership changes, and the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020 only deepened the hatred. Publicly, Iranian leaders refer to America as the Great Satan, and anti-U.S. protests are common. For Americans in Iran, it's one of the least welcoming places to visit. U.S. citizens have been detained, and there are strict travel warnings against visiting the country. If there's one nation where being American can be outright dangerous, Iran tops the list. Number 4. North Korea. This one is no surprise. North Korea's government has spent decades cultivating anti-American sentiment, portraying the U.S. as its number one enemy. The Korean War left scars that still haven't healed, and North Korea's leaders have used this history to fuel propaganda against America. The U.S. has imposed some of the harshest sanctions on North Korea due to its nuclear weapons program. And while American leaders have attempted diplomatic talks, tensions remain high. For North Koreans, the idea that the U.S. is plotting to overthrow their government is deeply ingrained. Traveling to North Korea as an American? Almost impossible. And if you do, you risk being detained under suspicion of espionage. Number 5. Venezuela. Venezuela's hostility towards the U.S. largely comes from political tensions. The U.S. refused to recognize Nicolas Maduro as the country's legitimate leader, instead backing opposition leader Juan Guaidó. This move was seen by many Venezuelans as direct American interference in their sovereignty. The economic collapse of Venezuela has been worsened by U.S. sanctions, and many citizens blame America for their struggles. Anti-American sentiment is widespread, with government propaganda painting the U.S. as the villain behind their country's crisis. While American tourists aren't in immediate danger, it's clear that the U.S. isn't welcomed by Venezuela's leadership or a large part of its population. Number 6. Cuba. The U.S. and Cuba have had a long, complicated history. From the failed Bay of Pigs invasion to the Cold War embargo, distrust runs deep. While diplomatic relations improved slightly under Obama, they took a step back under Trump, and sanctions returned. Cuba's government frequently blames the U.S. for its economic problems, and anti-American rhetoric is common in state media. While Cuban citizens may be more welcoming, the government still sees America as a threat. Number 7. Afghanistan, Taliban government. After 20 years of war, the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, leaving the country in chaos. Many Afghans saw the American presence as an occupation, while others felt abandoned when the U.S. left. The Taliban, now back in power, has openly criticized the U.S. and its actions. For Americans, Afghanistan is one of the most dangerous places to visit. The risk of kidnapping, detention, or violence is extremely high, and anti-American sentiment remains strong. Number 8. Pakistan. Once considered a key ally of the United States, Pakistan's relationship with America has taken a sharp turn in recent years, with trust eroding on both sides. A major breaking point was the 2011 U.S. operation that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad without prior notification to Pakistani authorities. Many Pakistanis saw this as a blatant violation of their sovereignty, fueling widespread suspicion that America does not respect their national interests. The war on terror, in which Pakistan played a significant role, also left the country with heavy casualties and economic burdens, while many Pakistanis felt the U.S. abandoned them when its interests shifted. Accusations that Pakistan harbored militants, coupled with the suspension of military aid, further worsened diplomatic ties. Despite the strained political relationship, Pakistanis have a complex view of America. While anti-U.S. protests are not uncommon, especially following drone strikes or policy decisions affecting South Asia, American culture, technology, and education remain highly admired among younger generations. Many Pakistanis seek visas for work, education, and business opportunities in the U.S. However, public opinion remains deeply divided. While some see the U.S. as a necessary partner, others believe Washington prioritizes its geopolitical interests at Pakistan's expense. The diplomatic relationship continues to be fragile, and any future cooperation depends on shifting regional dynamics. Number 9. Belarus. Belarus, often called Europe's last dictatorship, has followed Russia's lead in cultivating anti-American sentiment, particularly under the leadership of President Alexander Lukashenko. The relationship between Belarus and the United States has been tense for decades, with significant deterioration following the U.S. sanctions imposed due to Belarus's alleged human rights violations and election fraud. Washington has accused Lukashenko of suppressing opposition voices, leading to mass protests in the country. The Belarusian government, in turn, has blamed the U.S. for inciting unrest and attempting to interfere in its internal affairs. As Belarus aligns itself closer with Moscow, American influence in the region has drastically diminished, with diplomatic relations remaining cold. While anti-American rhetoric dominates the Belarusian government's stance, the general public is not necessarily hostile toward individual Americans. Many Belarusians continue to seek education and business opportunities in Western countries, including the U.S. However, travel between the two nations has become increasingly complicated, with Belarus imposing restrictions on Western NGOs and media outlets. With ongoing tensions surrounding the Ukraine conflict and Belarus's support for Russia's military strategies, the likelihood of improved U.S.-Belarus relations remains slim in the near future. Number 10. Syria. Syria has been a hotspot of conflict for over a decade, and U.S. involvement in the region has only added to the resentment. The Syrian government, led by Bashar al-Assad, has long accused the United States of destabilizing the country by supporting rebel groups and imposing severe economic sanctions. Since the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, the U.S. has carried out airstrikes, provided military support to Kurdish forces, and imposed policies aimed at isolating the Assad regime. While Washington argues these actions are necessary to counter terrorism and promote stability, many Syrians see the U.S. as an occupying force that has contributed to the destruction of their homeland. The humanitarian crisis, compounded by economic struggles due to American-led sanctions, has further fueled anti-U.S. sentiments across different factions in Syria. For American travelers, Syria remains one of the most dangerous destinations in the world. The U.S. government has issued strict warnings against visiting the war-torn country due to the high risk of kidnappings, terrorist activity, and hostility toward foreigners. In areas controlled by the Assad regime, America is often depicted as the primary villain behind Syria's suffering, with state propaganda blaming Washington for years of war and instability. While some Syrians still differentiate between the American government and its people, the overall sentiment remains one of deep distrust, making the U.S.-Syria relationship one of the most fractured in modern geopolitics. So, is it safe to be American abroad? It depends. While not every citizen in these countries hates Americans, their governments and media often push anti-U.S. narratives. Diplomatic tensions, military conflicts, and economic sanctions continue to fuel hostility. What do you think? Do these countries have valid reasons, or is it all political propaganda? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more insights on global affairs.